Here's what a successful organization looks like to me. This is all about leadership, and it has to be sincere and authentic. From there, culture is formed. It morphs itself. Culture is greatly confused. Culture is not the fitness center or the fresh fruit or the healthy snacks in the cafe. It's how we treat each other. It's how we talk about each other when we're not together. And that's why people want to come back to work.
NAI Global presents How's Biz?
Greetings and welcome to the NAI Global's podcast, How's Biz? I'm Gary Marsh. I'm excited about today's podcast. We have three guests, each of whom come from different backgrounds and expertise, and we want their insights and perspectives to explore a topic that is one of the most pronounced issues impacting the commercial real estate industry today, and it's a problem of such magnitude that it appears likely to plague the industry for the foreseeable future. And what we're talking about is office market vacancy rates. The parallel conversation, and that's what this podcast is called, Workplace Strategy, is because there's a large discussion underway about hybrid and remote workforces. There's return to office mandates, and there are some trends leading toward greater office occupancy across the U.S., but we're still nowhere near what we used to be pre-pandemic. And this issue is plaguing all downtowns because it's not just office workers, but they bring the foot traffic that brings the business for restaurants and dry cleaners and bars and shoe repair shops and all that stuff. So with that said, let me give brief introductions to our panel. Again, excited and thank you all for being here. First guest I'd like to introduce is Jim Scalo. He's with NAI Burns Scalo in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Jim and his firm are fairly new member affiliates of NAI Global. They joined a year ago, and they're already embracing our network full force and doing what they can to impact it in a positive way. Jim, before the pandemic, wrote a book, and the book's called Work Them to Life, Upgrade Your Office Space to Win the Talent War. It's ironic that he did this just before the pandemic, and then of course we have this situation we're in and why we're doing the podcast, but clearly based on Jim's work from just now 4 or 5 years ago, he'll have a pretty good insight and opinion of what's going on. Jim also has a front row seat of the Pittsburgh's emergence as a tech hub and recognized early that superior amenity-rich office space is essential to not only attracting and retaining the highest caliber of employees, but also getting the most productivity out of them. The second panelist I'm introducing is Toni Navy, a future of work keynote speaker and global workforce consultant. She helps companies overcome the challenges of leading a global, multi-generational and hybrid workforce. She's a 3-time Fortune 500 company leader and has over 25 years experience in such roles as VP of Operations and HR Director and executive consulting roles with Apple, Apple Computer, of course, Hewlett Packard, Hitachi, Chapman Properties, and to name some others we could, but moving on. Mike Robbins is also with us. I met Mike a few years ago. He was a keynote at an SIR conference. Mike's a keynote speaker and teamwork expert. He also coaches on leadership and emotional intelligence. He's an author and former professional baseball player. His book, Bring Your Whole Self to Work, declares for teams and organizations to thrive, it is essential for leaders to create environments where people feel safe enough to bring all of who they are to work. This therefore enables staff to operate with employees and have the courage, trust, and vulnerability to do their best jobs and their best work. People are able to unlock their innovation and enhance their connection and performance at the highest level when they get to be who they are at work. So welcome to the program, Mike. When we're done, we'll publish the podcast and you'll have full bios. Mike's also the author of, I believe, 5 other books or 4 other books. So great panel. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
the first question I want to jump into, and it's really for all three of you to address, is that, again, the topic is the impact of remote and hybrid work and the newly coined RTO or return to offices trend, which there's a combination here that of directives and mandates, and there's some wishful thinking, I think, to getting it enforced, but that's another matter. So really, in your opinions, folks, is this a Me Too shall pass moment? You know, like after 9/11, and Jim might remember this, no one wanted to lease the upper floors of high-rise office buildings in big cities out of fear that some plane may run into them. But so that, you know, this could just blow over. But what do you guys think? Is there some permanence to it, or is it improving? And why don't we go from there? And maybe Jim, why don't you lead us off?
Well, thank you. It's a really good question. I don't think anyone has any certainty to it. I think what we try to do is pay attention to society and understand that society continues to move and evolve. And the question is the genie out of the bottle. With this, and I believe that success in business is really about two things: work plus time. I think those that want to hide will hide, and those that want to step forward will step forward. And success in business is really about your network. One of the terms that we use commonly with a lot of young people is your network is your net worth. And you can't get that unless you are seen. So I think that society, though, has changed, and that flexibility is important for most, and that life has become about lifestyle, rightfully so. I think the issue with that is that you have to be able to afford it. So at that point, where do you maximize your income? Through your work. But I don't think it'll ever go back the way it was.
Very well. Toni, would you like to share your thoughts or add to what Jim was saying?
No, absolutely. I definitely agree. We will not go back to the way things used to be because the entire world has shifted in regards to how we work, how we connect with each other, how we do business, and who we're doing business with. And so a few things jump out for me in regards to the shift. I do think it's a permanent shift just because you are now able to tap into workforces and connect with people that we wouldn't have had access to before because they can be in some little town somewhere but have really great qualifications. And if it's the right position and the right fit, because I agree with Jim, every industry is going to be different, and every company, no matter what industry, they're going to do this different in regards to their hybrid work or how much they want people in office or otherwise. But we're able to tap into, unrepresented categories and other people that are living their life, like you said, lifestyle first. But I also think that each company in each industry is going to do it different. So when you think about some of the top hybrid workforce companies like HSBC, they just won their 2023 Personnel Today Awards for being one of the best hybrid working, companies in basically in the nation. And, of course, they're worldwide. But their biggest thing was being able to have excellent structure in doing this, as well as being sustainable. So they made sure they had the digital innovation, the inclusion, and meeting generational needs and cross company needs. But it has helped them become one of the best employers in their space. And they resulted in losing 40% of their office space. We talked about, different spaces around the world. They used to have their headquarters in Canary Wharf in London, and they actually let go of that space. But they still are touting that they have higher engagement, steady productivity because of their flexible first policy. So it depends on the company, depends on, who it is and how they choose their, culture or their company culture, how they want that to be. So you got people like Apple or companies like Apple that are like, you need to get an office 3 times a week. That's just the way we do it. Otherwise, up into, you being terminated, they are actually checking people, making sure that they're badging in and badging out for their 3 days, or it could escalate to potentially termination. So, there's that balance of how a company is approaching it based upon their culture, based upon how they want their people to work. And I still agree with Jim, and I'm sure Mike will chime in from a teaming standpoint. making sure that you are bringing people in when it makes sense, when it's relevant, and hopefully when they can engage more, where they need to collaborate, need to make faster decisions, and do things a little bit more cohesively if they're able to actually be in office and have that face-to-face time. And then other times, of course, you're going to deal with people that are from around the world and they still have to figure out a way to work, build relationships so that as they are working together virtually, they can, make a bigger or more significant impact.
Excellent. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what Jim and Toni said is spot on. And I mean, I look at this from an interesting perspective. So, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. A lot of our clients are tech companies, Silicon Valley based, San Francisco based tech companies. We work with a lot of companies in other industries, whether it's healthcare or finance or real estate. And it does seem to vary from what we've seen industry by industry, as well as part of the country or part of the world. I do think, and I agree with both Toni and Jim, I don't think it's going back. Another factor that I don't think we talk about enough in this process is for all of the uncertainty we've had over the last number of years through the pandemic, and then, of course, on the other side of the pandemic with economic uncertainty, the job market has stayed relatively strong and unemployment has stayed low. What that's done is companies don't have as much leverage. They can say all they want. You got to come in 3 days a week, but they don't want to lose talent. So employees still have a lot of leverage. As that changes, and I'm not in any way a macroeconomic expert, so I don't know, and I don't want unemployment to go up personally for anybody. But as things change economically and as we get further away from the pandemic, while I don't think we're going to go back to pre-pandemic ways, I do think over the next series of months and years, things will change. And what the data shows us is that a lot of more senior folks who are a bit older, really want people back in the office. And then the younger people are, the less they care about being in the office because they haven't had as many years of experience working in the office. And their response often when I talk to younger people is like, why? So if I'm a Gen Z somebody, and I'm 23, 24 years old, I was in college, coming out of college during COVID. I don't really see the value and the necessity to be there. If I'm a millennial and I'm raising young kids, I want to be at home so I can pick my kids up from school and take them to stuff. So a lot of it is stage of life things. And if we're in our 50s or 60s or even older, we not only worked for a long time in the office, if we have kids, our kids are a bit older, so we have a little more flexibility. So some of the lifestyle aspects of it really factor in. And one last thing I'll say is that here in the Bay Area, like we've seen San Francisco get quite depressed through the pandemic and on the other side. And part of it is just because it's so expensive to live here. A lot of people moved away, but kept their jobs working for the companies. So they can't come back to the office because they now live in Topeka or they live in Albuquerque or wherever. So they're not able to even come back to the office. It's a larger endeavor to get everybody together.
Yeah, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area as well, and well, north of it, but certainly my roots are there and worked in the city for my former employer many years ago. But San Francisco is the worst in terms of vacancy. I did see yesterday some news that New York and Miami is coming back substantially from an office occupancy. So that's a healthy thing to see. I wanted really Jim and Mike to address the teamwork and culture question a bit more, especially again, when I first met Mike, he was just off his book, Bring Your Whole Self to Work. And when you're not bringing any part of yourself to work physically, when I thought about doing this panel, first thing I thought about was Mike Robbins because of that book. It's a great book, by the way. But the teaming and culture thing, and Toni, you referenced it, but Jim, your book is also about the value of teaming. And when we were young, once upon a time, we were all young, we sure needed mentors. And I thank the Lord above, I've had 4 good ones that I can count on, or I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing even remotely successfully. So there's that balance. But again, back to the question, Jim and Mike. Jim, go first. Talk about the importance of teamwork and culture and how you miss that if you're not in the office, or how do you build it if you are hybrid or remote?
Yeah, I mean, it's good discussion. I mean, I'm in a position where I'm an employer of hundreds of people, in our operating businesses, which is brokerage, management, construction, development, and also owners of millions of square feet of office space. So I'm on both sides of this. And And having the opportunity to work with so many successful organizations over the years, here's what a successful organization looks like to me. This is all about leadership, and it has to be sincere and authentic. From there, culture is formed. It morphs itself. Culture is greatly confused. Culture is not the fitness center or the fresh fruit or the healthy snacks in the cafe. It's how we treat each other. It's how we talk about each other when we're not together. And that's why people want to come back to work. A lot of the huge corporations have terrible cultures, and that's why people don't want to come back.
Yeah.
But if you like who you work with and you like where you work, you want to be there. We've stood up at town halls and said, we need two types of people. Every organization does. Those that want a career and those that want a paycheck. And we've been strident enough to ask them to raise their hand so they could identify which one they were, so we would therefore know who to invest in. And it was quite interesting, and people got a message. Now, the third leg of the stool for a successful organization, this is going to be very biased, but it's very accurate, is a great workplace, a great office space, a great campus. And this is why you're seeing the migration now from the old office to the new. We really have to bifurcate the category. And I personally do not have an answer for old real estate, old office buildings. The old urban needle. It's in trouble. The 100-year-old building, low ceilings, small restrooms, things like that. What we're seeing nationally is the new product getting absorbed, and it's not getting built. So a great question for the future is there going to be a building boom of new product at some point when interest rates come down and construction costs settle in and demand continues to increase, right? So you have grid parity, which we don't have. I'll say this also. We've had such payroll pressure where payroll, and I've looked at hundreds of financial statements. I'm trying to be quick, but payroll for most organizations, anyone without inventory, payroll and payroll related is your number one operating expense. It used to be 55 to 65% of an operating expense budget. Because of the upward pressure we've had on payroll, it's 65 to 75% today. So we are in a period right now of cost cutting. So everyone's cost cutting. But I'll compare that to rent. Rent was 3 to 5% of an operating expense budget. Whip-de-doo, right? Because payroll went up, rent now is 2 to 4% of an operating expense. So people can afford to pay more for better product. But what's happening today is they're taking less square feet, paying more per index, per square foot, and still saving aggregate dollars. And that's what CFOs are really focused on now. And then as they work with the HR groups to say, hey, we need a better workplace, we got to have the amenities. The amenities are important inside the building as well as outside the building. Where's the building located? What's the walk score, right? That's really big that we're seeing everywhere today. One last thing on the payroll pressure, we are hearing that there is a lot of adventure right now in taking remote work offshore. Because if I can hire somebody and pay them 1/3 the amount, and I don't know them, and they're doing a back office function like HR or accounting, that's exactly, I want to save that money because that's the spot we're in. So
to your point, Jim, the Class A office space, the very best of the best in the best locations in our biggest cities, those vacancy rates are 8 to 10%, and in some buildings even less. To your point, so Mike, you come from a baseball background, so you had a team role. I remember you talking about no pressure being a relief pitcher in a tight ball game late in the ball game. That's pressure exacerbated. So the team culture quite well from your career in sports. But here we are talking about, and before the podcast started, Jim mentioned what we all need to be reminded of, that office work is a fairly minuscule part of the entire workforce. I think, to quote him, 75% of most jobs people go to every day.
Yeah.
The office sector is one area where there seems to be an option at this point. But that said, Mike, again, you really do coach, and you also talk about authenticity and how important that is. So why don't you go through some of the most important teamwork cultural elements that you see, and how that all relates to this hybrid work or not issue?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been studying team performance and culture for almost 24 years now. I mean, you mentioned I have a background in sports. I had a chance to play baseball for, at Stanford, and then professionally for a few years. And there's so many intangible aspects. I mean, Jim talked about the culture not being the space, although at the same time, the space obviously is important as we're thinking about real estate. And however, culture is not also just about being together, because in a pre-COVID world, there were a lot of people who worked together in the same physical space and didn't connect with each other and didn't feel connected to what they were doing. And right. So just because we're together in the same physical space, whether that space is fantastic and new and a great product, or it's an old, funky, sort of depressing building, that obviously has an impact, but it's not just being together. And then the reality, what we found, again, when we were all forced to go home, those of us that weren't essential workers and didn't have to be on site where we were during the height of the pandemic, we realized, oh, we can actually get a lot of stuff done virtually that we didn't realize we can get done. The good news was that opened up a lot of possibilities. The bad news is, from a culture standpoint, it became harder to connect. And as time went on, and people, again, I work with a lot of tech companies, people are moving around, changing jobs. If I don't already know you and I haven't worked with you and I'm not connected to the company, people are less invested. So what I often talk to leaders about now, because here's the reality, nobody has figured out the hybrid working yet. Everyone's struggling with it to some degree, the people who have to deal with it. And as you mentioned, Gary and Jim, you talked about this before we hit record, it is a privilege, and it's not everyone, but it's white collar jobs, people working in office spaces like that. And so when I'm coaching leaders, from the CEO on down to senior leaders to mid managers to sort of folks who are just getting into management and leadership, it's like you have to be that much more creative on how you stay connected to and engaged with your team these days. It's the same conversation I was having with leaders 10 years ago, managing people in other physical locations, because they were finding, oh, it's easier for me to manage my people who are here in this office versus the ones who are on the other side of the country or the other side of the world. Now that's just expanded to everybody. So it's like, how do we stay engaged and connected? We're not going to be in the office every day. Even the companies, Toni, to your point, of the Apples of the world who are saying 3 days a week or whatever the mandate is, it's still like, I'm in on Tuesdays and you're in on Wednesdays. And you know what I mean? We're going to all be in on Tuesdays so we can have meetings. Every leader has to really customize some degree of their leadership style and how they're going to manage their team and how they're going to tie that back to the culture and what we're trying to create collectively. And it's a little bit of the Wild West out there, even in the organizations that are more prescriptive about how they want the sort of hybrid return to office thing to work. It's still a lot of the pressure is put on individual managers, as is often the case, to connect with people authentically and really keep people engaged in their work as much as possible.
Yeah, it seems like the pandemic and post-pandemic just complicated an already challenging process, which is, of course, management leadership.
Yep.
Toni, maybe you can address one of your favorite topics, is combining all these elements we're discussing, teamwork, culture, and the multi-generational aspect and multicultural elements as well. And again, we're talking about the office market predominantly, but what are you telling your clients these days, and how to prep for just performance at a higher level given the circumstance?
I mean, and that's a good question and kind of a good segue, but I'd also like to chime in off of Mike's comment that, because those were really great, great perspective. And the whole hybrid notion since the pandemic and everything that's been going on is new for the majority of companies, but some companies have gotten it right, because I remember being at Hewlett Packard back in the day, like, and for me, my back in the day is still the 90s, but still, even my son's like, if you have to say back in the day, you're old. Okay. I'm like, you're 25, guy, hush. You still need some help, buddy. But even in that period of time frame at Hewlett Packard, we were working remote and in office, and it didn't necessarily mean the salespeople that were always, out. And of course, they were hybrid for the most part. But at Hewlett Packard, they had, Hewlett and Packard had the book called The HP Way. We all had to read it. It was all about creating a foundation of culture, but they had done this for so many years. We're talking decades and decades of creating the culture that allowed for, and putting the right systems in place that allowed for, hybrid work, all remote work. There were a lot of people that didn't even come to the office, but we were still extremely productive because it took such a long time, everybody being on the same page. And I agree with both Jim and Mike that sometimes you do need to see people, but that doesn't necessarily drive the culture. It is leadership. Like Mike was saying, there are different ways to actually skin that cat. And we talk about culture or company culture. I think it's two different ways of thinking about culture also. There's the company culture, but then there are all these diverse individuals from different backgrounds around the world that also now are working together, sometimes face to face and sometimes not. And how do we, like you said, Gary, how do we put all these things together and make it work? And some of the things are going to be different depending on the culture of the company, how the leadership is leading their teams, and I think strategically the overarching leadership. So at HP, you came in, you were indoctrinated because this was the way we worked. And many times getting together with individuals, there were people we never saw until we went to retreats. And that was one of the things that was extremely powerful. I'm sitting in the Mountain View office or the Palo Alto office. Many of my clients, I had as an HR business partner there, I had clients across the nation in Canada and in Mexico. I never saw half these people live until we came into retreats or until I was on a plane facilitating, sessions with them to bring all their teams together. And then it was, okay, now we can go back, but we established, like Jim said, if you can establish a relationship, or maybe it was you, Mike, then you actually are working together. Yeah, that makes it easier, right? Because you have that credibility, respect, and that trust. But when you don't have that, how do you do that? And many times, sometimes we're still having to do something virtual. And like you did during the pandemic, we're getting together on Zooms, but we're having a glass of wine or whatever. Bring your favorite beverage to whatever. And it's the happy hour on Zoom so we can connect, not professionally, but it's our group and our core group that can't physically be there together, but we can create some kind of personal dynamic and connection. So when we talk about bringing your whole self to work, no matter what that dynamic is, it is shifting mindsets on how leaders are going to lead and how people show up and the expectations of how we are going to also drive performance. And that takes time to be able to say, okay, a leader's going to need to lead differently. How we get work done now is done differently. What systems are we putting in place? How are we communicating more effectively? And how do we create those touch points so that there can be a personal connection, whether it's face-to-face, in the office on whatever the schedule is, or whether it's these retreats or these other connections that are created so that people can really connect and still come back and get work done. And it's difficult, but you have to figure out what is going to work for each organization. And much of that starts with leadership and the culture that they want to set as they move forward, because your people are going to do what your leaders, what leaders are saying that they want done. And I don't mean, hey, you come back into the office, this is what the leaders want. I don't mean that. I mean how they're setting up the expectation of the kind of world, the kind of corporate world that they want to lead. And it's going to attract and actually engage an employee to want to be productive, to want to be there and bring your whole self to work. Mike, you didn't say it, and I'm waiting for you. I need you to chime back in with it. That whole self to work is, look, I'm a mom, I'm picking somebody up at 3, or I'm a person that, is an introvert, or maybe there's somebody, there's people that are in disability, situations where they've felt more comfortable to work because they can work from home and they're not having to deal with, not having the same access and the uncomfortable things that happen. So there's a lot of different dynamics culturally as well, religious, all these things that come into play, that all of a sudden you're trying to find who you're wanting to work with and making sure you're creating a space for everybody to feel comfortable and figuring out those things and kind of, give and take, making some different adjustments as you go. It's really adjust, see how this works, and keep doing the surveys so you can really get the feedback to make it a place that works for everybody to the extent that you want.
One of the things I thought about when you're saying, and again, all of you have talked about culture and leadership at length already, is, and this is not a question, it's just an observation, just because I was a shareholder for many years. For GE, especially under Jack Welch, was an iconic company, and their culture, and this is the way we did things, and the Sigma, whatever. And yet they ultimately didn't thrive and succeed. I actually wrote about last year, they sold their, I think it's called Coltonville, their campus retreat up in upstate New York. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, but anyway, there's some element, that's another whole podcast, I think, of what do you do to keep evolving and changing. But I'd like all of you, this isn't on the subject, but and I want to come back to real estate with Jim, but very touch briefly on the one thing that we haven't talked about so far, which is innovation and creation. The biggest buzzword right now in business is AI. And I've read about it that others have said the emergence of AI is probably going to help the office market because it's such a new field that you really need that innovation. And Jim, you remember from the old real estate stuff, you guys would build extra wide stairwells. So if you're walking down the stairs when someone's walking up the stairs and you go, hey, I haven't talked to you in a while, and you have a side meeting right there on the stairs, but the stairs are wide enough so you can do that, not obstruct the stairwell, because people are spontaneously creating. You're a developer, builder, investor, Jim, and you've said it's not just great fresh fruit and other snacks that make a culture or a great place to work, but what are some of the design elements to an office building where it's accommodative to by chance meeting, spontaneity, and creation?
Yeah, the office building is definitely changing. As I said, you have to bifurcate the asset class from the old to the new. But the new is about bringing the outside in. It's rooftop decks, balconies, what's around it. As I said, what submarkets it in, what's the walk score. It's not just the building. It's actually not about the box at all anymore. You know, the A words, amenities, right? And the staples today are fitness centers and conference centers and cafes, restaurants. Mixed use developments are really popular. Generally, we start them with residential because you need people. So you have for sale housing, for rent housing. Then you bring in the office component. Then you bring in the food and beverage or the retail component, the hotel component, all the things that follow people. Many times these facilities, depending on the size of the campus, can have hospitals or even sports facilities. Things like that, where childcare, no one's talked about that yet. That's the biggest thing today for the return to the office for young parents. And so that product has changed. And I'll just, last thing I'll say, because I want to close out on leadership, I love how everybody's queuing on leadership because it begins and stops there. I agree with that. And that's so important. But I think what we have to think about is, what does the next wave of leadership look like? The average CEO's tenure is 6.9 years. We're 4.5 years into a pandemic. You asked me about AI. A guy said to me this week that we thought email was going to save us time. It didn't, but AI will. That's a really interesting comment. And the other thing that I'll say about today's deal flow that we're seeing that concerns me is that the average term of a new office deal is 10 years, sometimes 15, sometimes 20, depending on the size of them. But yet everyone's cutting their workspace in half. But yet we all sat here and said, no one's figured this out yet. So I think there's going to be a lot of short-term decisions that aren't going to work long-term.
Along those lines, and as it relates to innovation, there's a couple things. What we learned during the pandemic when not everybody, but most everybody was home, a lot of work could get done when we weren't together that surprised us, but there were certain things that couldn't get done and just got missed when we weren't together. You can't recreate. I mean, even this conversation, as great as it is that we can talk on Zoom and people can listen or watch, or it would be a different conversation if we were all sitting in the same room. And like, I spoke this morning on a global management meeting for one of our tech company clients. They have a quarterly meeting for all their managers. It's great that they can gather everyone together that way virtually. I can speak to everyone. They can hear updates from some of the senior leaders. We don't have to fly everybody in. We don't have to send a memo. That's fantastic. But again, that would have been a very different event if they did fly everybody in from around the world and were together for a few days. And again, so it can be a both and thing, but as it relates to innovation, as it relates to things that are new and different. And when you talk about AI specifically, I was at a conference in the fall with some of the key leaders in the tech world talking about AI. And one of the co-founders of ChatGPT said, this was back in October, so, 10 months ago or whatever it was. He said, we're like in 1990 of the internet with AI right now, which kind of blew my mind because I went, oh my gosh, it's already changed so many things, but we have no idea what it's going to look like. And even the people in that room who are way smarter than me and really on the cutting edge of this stuff, they were basically saying, yeah, we don't really know what's going to happen either. Like, we're just trying to keep up with the technology. So I say that, and to Jim, to your point, like, there's probably going to be some short-term decisions that may not be good. The world, if we have this conversation next year or 5 years from now, God only knows what's going to happen in that time. And so coming back to like leaders really leading, humans really connecting with each other, I really feel like, authentic connection is going to be fewer and further between, but it's going to be even more important as we move through whatever this next phase of all this change and disruption that's happening right now.
So going back to our core discussion, is, really address the hybrid situation. We have talked about it, maybe the tactical piece. I'd like to hear some of the tactical piece, because again, all of you are in the situation where you're interfacing with companies that are doing it either willingly, intentionally, or kind of reluctantly, quote, for now, is what are some of the tactics that companies can do? So this is the kind of how to make it better for them, can do right away to improve their hybrid management workforce, give them inspiration.
It does start with the policy in regards to how often you want people working, or what flexible work policy that you're going to allow people to work. So it's consistent, meaning, hey, we at least want you in the office a couple of days, like American Express. They do a 2-day, a week, pick whatever those days are, what works with your team, what works with your leaders, and making sure that it's relevant, hopefully, to engage your people. So it's picking that policy and saying, hey, what kind of hybrid model do we want to work with? How many days are really important based upon us, engaging our workforce. So I think a part of it is connecting with our workforce, saying whether it's surveys or just group, kind of groupthink conversations, because your workforce having a part of that policy creation, and then leaders creating that, doing it joint, makes everybody feel like, okay, this is something we're all trying to work together, and it creates an environment where people want to come in. So you're creating a policy, but you're engaging your workforce and leaders at the same time, which usually yields a much higher adoption all the way across the board of people creating an environment that really is going to work and make people happy and more productive and more engaged in the business.
Jim?
100%. The pressure's on the manager. I can't manage the marketing department the same way I manage the accounting department. Totally different. Creatives, right, versus the legal department, which is analytical, the accounting department, which is black and white, and then you have creatives. So you've got to go to those managers, and that pressure has to be on them. We just had someone leave our company, and I went to the manager. I said, you need to take accountability. And he said, what are you talking about? I said, you need to know where your people are. You were surprised when he left. That's on you. You should not be surprised. What we do not want are surprises in investing, or in investment of people, investment of anything, right? I agree it starts at the top, but you've got to drop that responsibility. I think what happened in business is when things were really good, there was a lot more autonomy without accountability. Mm-hmm. Now there needs to be accountability while keeping autonomy. Yes. And that pressure has to go to that manager. And they need to be accountable to know where their people are. Like this panel is saying, everybody's in a unique situation. Everybody has a personal life that we don't know about. But that manager has to know about that.
Yeah. It seems like a communications issue too. So Mike, what are your thoughts, and how, top 1 or 2 pieces of advice to do it better than the way we're doing it now?
I think they're just, I mean, we're sort of talking a lot about, flexibility and agility here without saying it specifically. I mean, I don't know why I keep thinking about this as we're talking, but sometimes I even think about just the way we dress now in business versus how we dressed 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I just went to a conference over the weekend of an association that I've been a part of for 24 years, but I hadn't been to one of our conferences in 12 years. And and I'm not someone who cares that much about clothes, and I don't dress up myself. And I always sort of begrudgingly wore suits and ties when I had to. But I just looked around and went, wow, when I first showed up at this association 24 years ago, I was in a suit and tie, as were all the other men, and the women were all dressed up. And here we all were. I mean, people were in tennis shoes and t-shirts and the whole bit, right? And I don't really care, but it just made me laugh. And so sometimes, even when I think about now working in the office versus working remotely versus working hybridly, is obviously more substantive than what we wear. But sometimes I talk to leaders that are so stuck in the way things used to be. Do you really want to die on that hill of like making everyone wear a suit and tie? I mean, if that's essential for your work, okay, but a lot of people don't own them, don't want to wear them, and it's just passé. Get over it. And the same thing with like, if we need to be together, let's do that. But if you just need people to show up, to sit in their seats so you know that they're there, so you can feel like they're doing their job, back to Jim's point, there's probably a missing thing with accountability. And Gary, to your point, there's some missing communication. Some people can be incredibly effective and productive at home most of the time. You just have to know if that's the case. Other people can be playing video games and running errands and doing all kinds of stuff. You got to figure out, without micromanaging them, like what's going on and what's working, and have those, like I like to call them, sweaty palm conversations with the real people you're working with. Because even before the pandemic, there were still people working remotely. A lot of people I worked with, they had that one person. It's like, hey, they're so valuable. We're going to let them move back to where they grew up and still have their job and work remotely. And they'll get on airplanes every now and again, but we're going to trust they can be autonomous and do it. The same rule applies now. It's just at scale, and we have to figure that out a little bit better.
And I think, to add to that, Mike, people are having to also just be more definitive about the deliverables that someone has to have in a hybrid situation. Think about it. A sales guy or salesperson, excuse me, out there, you can see their numbers, you can see what they're doing or what they're not doing. But, that intangible job, it's having the leadership as well as whomever else is involved be able to make sure it's all about what results are they creating, and more definitive about that, so that if you're home playing video games, we're going to know it because here's your deliverables and they're not happening. If you are, we're going to know it because they're happening, and you're doing a task force and you're doing all these other things that make it work a little bit better.
There was an organization or a body of work that we did a lot of work with Gap for years. And one of their really innovative leaders had this idea that he did with most of their folks in HQ. So the folks that worked in the office, as opposed to people in the stores, they had something called ROWE, Results Only Work Environment, which basically gave people autonomy and flexibility. Like, hey, you don't have to show up at 9 and stay till 5 just to punch a clock here. That's not the nature of this work. If you can get your work done in a creative way, we're going to trust you to do that. We are going to have some mandates for when we meet, but this was pre-COVID, but the same rule applies in most organizations. Like, if you really think about it, when do we actually have to be together? How do we get our work done and hold people accountable? And there are companies now that are completely 100% remote. And then we have to understand on the front end, like, who are we hiring? Who's signing up for this? And what do people actually want? I think that's going to be more of the future of work. There's going to be completely remote companies. There's going to be hybrid companies. And then there's going to be, no, you have to be in the office every day for this company. And then people are going to choose what works for their life and their lifestyle. And companies are going to have to decide, who are we hiring and what's the culture we're setting around some of this. I think we're still in the messy middle part of that, but that's where I think we'll ultimately end up.
Hiring. I want each of you to address this. Toni, you used to be an HR director. You coached companies on hiring. You've all talked about leadership and culture, but we all started at the ground floor and then working our way toward the upper floors here. But hiring, it's like, who do you hire? Jim, you said, I think, that you sometimes will ask companies or your own employees, do you want a career or do you want a paycheck? I just need to know so I can invest in you accordingly. And invest is an operative word there, which is an issue that when I say our NAI global offices throughout the world, they want to hire new young brokers or analysts and whatnot, but they're reluctant to, because you sort of hire them, you train them, they just start getting good at their job, and then they go to some other competitor, which is a disaster. You just spent 8 years with them and lots of money and blah, blah. So each of you, again, address this. Jim, why don't you go first? You manage and own multiple companies, your clients own companies. Do they talk about hiring these days?
Yeah, I think retention is the key to the topic, and it's one that people probably don't measure well. Attraction is very different than retention. It's easy to attract, it's harder to retain. But the worst thing for an organization is when you invest that 5 years into somebody and they leave, and you like them, and you want them to stay. So we had lunch today with a 24-year-old superstar in our marketing department. We talked about career pathing. And he wants to go fast, and we said you have to go slow. The greatest success stories here are when we go slow with money and slow with title. And 15 years later, you're making a lot of money, but not 2 years later. And this is the problem with that young set, for sure, today. I have a son that works at an organization that would, I think, like my job. And I said, why don't you give me at least till Monday?
It's nice to have ambition. If that's
well, yeah,
that's an issue, then that's a good issue to have, right?
Yeah, it is. But we really do have to focus on career pathing. Here's what people want, in my view: money, movement, and meaning. Money, movement, meaning. So everybody wants to make more money. They want to know they have movement, upward movement. Then they want to know that there's meaning behind this work, and that this is a place I want to stay a long time. Now, we've been in business since 1956, so we can talk about it.
Yeah, I think it's a very significant moment. I think John.
One sec, something happened to the recording.
Yeah, I don't know what it was.
Go ahead and go back, Jim. You're going to make one.
No, what I said, we've been in business since 1956, and so we've been through a lot. And we talk about the experiences and the wisdom that it does exist in the organization, and that the young people really do need to mix it up with the different decades. When we look at the pie charts of how many people we have: 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and we really try to mix that up. But we try to on hiring, we're really trying to say this is a place that we will want you to stay for a long time, and we're going to make sure that we can career path you properly.
So you really do spend some time and invest in your internal analytics, if you will. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Good. That way to go, I should say. Toni, why don't you? This is a very loaded question, but number one is how do you hire, and what do you look for? What do you tell your clients?
My point was just to echo Jim's comment, and I thought it was powerful in regards to money, a candidate, money, movement, and meaning. Just because as you're attracting a candidate into an organization, it is about attracting them, it is about retaining, but sometimes it's giving the right carrot for the right individual relative to their needs and their wants, and still the wants and needs of the organization. So I think pairing that can be very powerful, and that's a great kind of framework to think about it. Money, movement, and meaning makes a lot of sense for a lot of individuals. Right now, we are in the biggest generation at the majority of our workforce being millennials and Gen Z. 33% are Gen X, and 27% comprise silent generation and baby boomers now. So this is a whole different game changer, that we may not be in a situation where we can retain individuals that want to stay 5 and 10 years and 15 years like it used to happen, because our Gen Z, that Gen Z and those millennials, they're like staying 3 or 4 years and they're gone. Yeah. So we are now, because of that stat, when I'm talking to individuals in regards to hiring, we are looking at different ways of helping leaders to do some of the succession planning and making sure they have that backup plan. It's almost like you've heard, oh, we've got a president and we've got a co-president. You're having those kinds of redundancies within the organization and systems set up so that when you are now needing to expect people to come and go, and not always necessarily to have somebody that wants to be here for 10 years. So that's one to Jim's point. And even though we don't like it, it is the reality. These kids are like, it's just different. And
let me interrupt though, because you're kind of addressing an issue that Jim mentioned earlier in terms of the office market, how bifurcated it is. There's new and there's old. There's very little in between. So it's almost like a different career or jobs thing. And Mike, you know this from being in the high tech business, so to speak. That's not your thing, but those are your clients in many cases. Is if you're in the tech world at least 10 years ago, and you're in San Francisco and you've been there 5 years, people start thinking you're kind of a loser, man. You haven't moved on already.
Right.
I mean,
Whereas other industries, it's like, wait, we're just getting warmed up here.
totally. So, I mean, you have to hire, I think, knowing your industry and what you're hiring for and the expectations. To Tony's point, it can vary based on who we're hiring, the level we're hiring at, but also the type of organization. And look, I mean, skills matter, background matter, pedigree matters, experience matters, all that stuff. But at the end of the day, I mean, I've been coaching leaders in all industries for many years to try to hire on culture fit. And does this person fit in with what we're doing? And not fit in the sense, I mean, you want a diverse team. And especially in today's world, you want people who have different ideas and different perspectives. But like, is this person bought into what we're trying to create here and how we do things? And even back to a lot of this conversation we've been having about hybrid working, what is the expectation this person have? Or even to Jim's point, I mean, a lot of young people somehow think they're going to be the CEO 6 months after they get hired. And it's a little bit of expectation setting, because we've also, for better or worse, raised our kids differently over the last couple generations in a lot of good ways. But now the expectation is like, look at me, I'm a star. So that changes some of the mindset. But if the desire is, I want to hire people who are going to come to work 5 days a week, who are going to stay at this company for the next 20 years, like, that's going to be a small subset of people that you can actually really hire in that situation. Or if it's like, hey, you know what, we're going to be a little more flexible with how we think about this. We want to find the best and the brightest. Maybe that means they're going to work more remotely and hybridly. Maybe we're only going to have them for 3 years or 5 years, but we're going to invest in them and know we're going to get something from them. And then the cycle's just going to repeat itself much more quickly than maybe we're used to. And we're just going to have to update and adjust the way we think about it, because it's 2024. Not 1998.
I just think that is the world we are dealing with. And I don't care what industry you're talking about. Every industry and every leader I'm talking to, whether it's commercial real estate, whether it's tech, they're all having this same, generational challenge and the sustaining and the intellectual capital and keeping or retaining their people. And if we don't flip that paradigm and think differently about how we hire and how we continue to, bring our people aboard, and think about it, there are people staying in the industry or staying working longer than they ever have before. You've got baby boomers and silent generation folks that sometimes it's like, thank goodness, because we've got some people that'll stay around. We need some of those B players that just show up. Half the time, it's just somebody showing up consistently that has some continuity in the business. And so that's one of the things that I've helped to coach, the new people that are coming in and hiring. It's, yes, what's going to entice and attract the right people, but also making sure you have a balance of individuals where you're going to have your players that are always consistent and will stay there and get the work done as you're rotating in and out some of these hot, people that are going to jump a little bit more. And it still is crazy, the kid coming out of school expecting at 25 to make 6 figures for working 3. I just got here, but how do you help them? As Jim said so eloquently, it's career pathing. This is how we do this. You're having to have those conversations, and it makes it engaging for what we have to do moving forward.
It seems that the whole subject of leadership and culture, there's an element that is reflective of our species as humans. Of there's a need for adaptation, and evolution to evolve. So sounds like it's a dynamic situation here. We're approaching an hour, so we probably should be wrapping up. It's been a fun conversation. And each of you said in your own way, we're not sure truly what happens next, but maybe just get your smaller crystal ball out for us. And in 2 to 3 years from now, it's not a long outlook, but Jim, what do you think the office market looks like in 2 to 3 years? It's a big question. I mean,
it's clear for us. New office wins. We use that. New office wins. That's what's going to win. The last thing I would say is this has been great. I mean, it is about leadership, but we heard that a lot today. So we're looking for the next generation of leaders, and I think we're all saying that we're better together than apart. Overall. Like, what we look for is, how do we make 1 + 1 = 3? How do we make 1 + 1 + 1 = 5? Right? That's what we're looking for with talent. And then lastly, how can we create an environment where they can make more money here and have the best experience than they can anywhere else? And that's how you retain them. And you're life friendly. Okay. And we are. Today, when a woman needs to go get her hair done at 2:00, we get it. Tony's laughing, but 10 years ago, we would have said, "Are you kidding me?"
No.
Right? I mean, but that never is the message. You don't have to get your work done, right? And this can't be about the world of self-interest, which generally it is. So how do we align the goals of self-interest with the goals of the organization?
Yeah.
And that's when we win.
And I think there's going to be more people coming back to the office in the coming years, Gary. I don't think it's going to be a straight line. I think the economic factors and the unemployment rate are going to impact it one way or the other. But I do think companies are going to continue to have to be flexible. And like I said earlier, I think there's going to be companies that are 100% in person for the most part. There's going to be companies that are 100% virtual and distributed, and then a lot of companies somewhere in the middle. And every company is going to continue to have to figure out how to hire and retain, as we've been talking about, and lead through the ambiguity of hybrid working and just make it work as best as possible. I do think we're doing a better job collectively now than we were 2 years ago as we were coming out of COVID. I still think it's pretty messy and there's a lot of uncertainty, but I think it's going to get a little bit better. Not to say that there's not going to be continual bumpy times and lots of disruption, but I think we're going to understand it better a few years from now and be operating more effectively than we are now.
Very well. Toni also addressed the workforce piece briefly. We are in a slowdown. We're seeing less and less hiring. We don't know what happens next. There's been economic uncertainty for a number of years now, but why don't you give us your final thoughts on where we may be in 2 or 3 years, and any thoughts on hiring?
My final thoughts there are just loving the conversation around not only leadership, but also just the hybrid and just this whole concept continuing. I think agile leadership is one thing that comes to mind, just because of the flexibility of you recognizing change is happening and it's going to continue to happen. Whether you go more hybrid, whether people coming back in the office, it's how are we going to be more fluid in leading our people and moving forward with the rolling dynamic that we have. That's number one. Number two, as far as workforce is considered, I like I believe her name is, she's the CEO of Slack. She had mentioned that a new focus is really going to be around not where people work. It's all about the work that is getting done. And I thought that was powerful, because if we really shift and focus on some of the right things, the right KPIs, the right performance indicators, it really helps us move that needle. And then my final thought in regards to hiring and moving forward, I think, is the collaboration factor that we have not put into this environment with all the generations. The millennials and Gen Zs are more collaborative than ever we've seen generations before. Remember the independent worker, all these people that really used to be able to work by themselves. They are very much a collective working or a collaborative working, group or generation. So there's got to be some way where we can get all of these generations together. Older generations having more infrastructure, newer generations or younger generations having this technology and innovation, where we can get them to collaborate so that we can produce better leaders that have a better foundation, but then feel like they're in the right environment across all generations, so that we can raise all of our ships at one time instead of just some of this piecemeal. That collaboration will be a huge factor for everyone to collectively come together and get more work done better, with a more flexible way of how we work, where we work, but still doing it all together as one.
Terrific. Well, you guys have been awesome. This has been a really fun conversation. I hope it's been enjoyable for you as well. You've been listening to the NAI Global How's Biz podcast series. And again, today's guests have been Jim Scalo with NAI Burns Scalo. He's the CEO of the company in Pittsburgh, PA. Great real estate company and great affiliate member office of the NAI Global platform. Mike Robbins is based out of Marin County, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge. A great keynote speaker, fun guy to be around, and a good thinker as well. Mike, thank you. And finally, Toni Navy, also a management trainer and keynote speaker. She's based in the Sonoma wine country. Thank you all for being a part of this podcast today, and for listeners to listen to some of the other podcasts that we've produced. Just go to the NAI Global website and look for podcasts, and you'll find our series. So thanks again for listening, and thank you guys for participating.
For having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to How's Biz, presented by NAI Global. Review, share, subscribe, and keep an eye out for the next episode.